Evan and Sam, thank you both for coming on here to have a disagreement. So to start, a few weeks ago, Congress passed and Joe Biden signed the Protecting America from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act, which is quite a mouthful. And essentially, it's forcing either a ban or divestment of TikTok. So, Sam, I'm going to start with you because you've been sort of early and vocal supporter of a divestiture or a ban on TikTok. So let's kick it to you and say why, why was what Congress did and what Joe Biden signed into law a good thing?
I mean, I was shocked that it actually got done, that America showed some spine to defend itself for once. I did not expect that to happen. Look, for me, it's really simple. I think TikTok's great. Like, I was early excited about TikTok. I think it's hilarious. I think it's it's very entertaining. I am, like a lot of people, less concerned about the addiction problems and teens and all the other crazy parts about TikTok. Like, I think I'm kind of a free market guy from that perspective. However, for me, I actually think hilariously it's kind of in the title, which is there is absolutely no question that TikTok, because it's not even a follow graph, it's literally like, we'll serve you whatever we want, has broad latitude to choose what people see day in and day out as Americans in the country. There is obvious, let's say, schism between U.S. and Chinese interests in a lot of issues globally. And I also argue that unlike traditional American companies, TikTok has members of the government on its board, right? It's not like there's like real clear separation as there is in the U.S. between state and for-profit exercises. So it's kind of those questions is like, if you said to an American, hey, there's going to be a thing that 200 million people look at every day that influences taste, where there are no rules about what's being shown at all, and it can be hyper-targeted, so you have no idea what anyone's seeing. And an adversary of ours sits on the board and controls where that application goes and who gets to see what. Would that be an acceptable thing to America from a national security standpoint? It's like, obviously not, right?
All right, Evan, there's definitely a disagreement here.
Well, I was going to start by saying, this is called the disagreement. We're supposed to disagree. But unfortunately, I'll start by saying there's a bunch of stuff we do agree on, right?
Oh, that's
First
lovely.
Is that
we love that.
TikTok employs a surveillance-driven business model, much like every other major social media company, where they monitor activity on the app and use that information to recommend content. That algorithm lacks transparency. We don't really know how it works or how it's making decisions about what to show to who, but we can assume it's doing it mostly to make TikTok money. And I think it's not out of the question to worry that a government, particularly a Chinese government, could try to influence that. I think it's also, totally right that the Chinese government engages in authoritarian policies that are incredibly harmful and undermine human rights, both in China and globally. But here's the thing. In the United States, we have this pesky little thing called the First Amendment. The First Amendment protects our free expression, and it prevents the government from engaging in acts of censorship unless they can prove that they have absolutely no other way to address their legitimate concerns. And so taking everything that Sam just said at face value, if we just accept like all this is true, everything the CIA is privately telling to Congress must be exactly right. Let's just take all that at face value for a second. It doesn't matter. Because the US government could address those concerns by, for example, passing algorithmic transparency legislation, something that human rights groups have been calling for years, so that we could force TikTok, but also Instagram and every other social media company to allow researchers and third-party auditors to take a look at how their algorithms work. So if they were engaged in a propaganda effort, we'd be able to catch them. If the concern is about the collection of Americans' data, in the way that the Chinese government or another foreign government could use that data to surveil people or in other ways do harm, then we should pass a frickin' privacy law. It's a national embarrassment that we do not have basic privacy laws here in the United States. And so the fact that we have those options on the table are what make it so blatantly unconstitutional to pass a law that forces a ban.
So can I address those concerns? Because I have addressing. I can address
No,
all
please
of them.
do. That's all we're doing.
First, I think it's really important to understand that like the First Amendment is not the big order bit on everything, right? There are limitations on speech, especially in times of war, et cetera. So it's not like we can just say, well, First Amendment, you can do anything you want, full stop. There are already many laws around foreign ownership of media for that exact reason, right? And this is just a different slight tweak with this kind of loophole, almost a loophole that's being exploited so far. So that's the first thing, and we can get into that in more detail. The second thing, algorithmic transparency. Here's the real problem. Is you can argue all you want about algorithmic transparency, whether it should exist, what that even means, et cetera. Here's the problem is that it comes down to incentives. And the reality is that you can have all the algorithmic transparency you want. And if you are a national government, right, that has an incentive for the U.S. to not be successful in any way, shape, or form, or take Taiwan, like a specific interest against ours, right? The reality is you can have all the algorithmic transparency you want. You can still create all sorts of 0 days and backdoors on yourself, right? And distribute out in ways that are untraceable and undetectable, such that, in the end of the day, you're able to pass any algorithmic transparency law, any framework you want, and still 100% allow it. Last thing I'd say, I think this is the most important, which is everyone's like evidence, you need evidence ahead of the fact. That's not actually how you do this if you were trying to subvert effectively the United States. Like, people say, well, where's the evidence this is happening already? The whole point would be that if you have a super weapon, which this would be in a lot of ways, you hide it, right? You hide it by any means. You don't even use it. So I'll give you an example. A lot of people, especially in the Jewish community, are very worried, for instance, that China has been effectively manipulating TikTok on purpose, right, to create dissent in the U.S. around some like Israeli-American, relations, promoting Hamas, right, in various ways. So here's the thing. It's plausible because it does undermine the United States. I bet they're not. Because, why waste your super weapon on something that's small to some degree, right? Like, you wait until you want to take over Taiwan, right, and you boil the frog slowly and carefully. And you probably don't even do it yourself. What you do is you create a bunch of backdoors or even, small tweaks. You make it exploitable so that you can have third parties do it for you. So I just think that the reality is the spirit is right. But in practice, life comes down to incentives. I don't worry about American companies intentionally having interest in the downfall of the United States. I think that is actually exactly the interest of the Chinese. And so it's crazy to allow them to have that level of access.
I mean,
right.
Is it, just go ahead. I mean, Alex, feel free to jump in, but just quickly, I'll just say,
keep going.
Not to quote our former president, I think he said, facts don't care about your feelings or whatever, but, the First Amendment doesn't care about your worries. It really doesn't. And so you're absolutely right that the First Amendment does have exceptions. But again, you haven't actually responded to my direct point, which is that to ban an app or force the sale of an app that's used by hundreds of millions of people to express themselves, where people are not just watching funny dance videos, they're posting about, as you just said, what's happening in Palestine. They're posting about politics. They're posting about, the U.S. election. To force a ban of an app like that, the U.S. government has to pass what's called strict scrutiny. I'm not making this up. This is basic, constitutional law 101 around the First Amendment. To pass strict scrutiny, the U.S. government would have to prove there is nothing else that they could do that would address these concerns short of a ban.
Yeah, I think that's.
Do we disagree that there's nothing else that they could do?
I don't think there's anything else they can do. When you have when you have a foreign government sitting on the board of a quasi public institution with split incentives, and the obvious example that there's no amount of diligence you could possibly do on the algorithm, for instance, that would give you confidence that they're not able to exploit it.
That's just not accurate, though. I mean, TikTok US is a US company housed in the US.
No, but its
CEO is Singaporean, and they are beholden to US law in the same way of any other company that operates in the US. And
except
if
for
you
it's
passed
been
an algorithmic transparency or privacy law that forced TikTok US, which again is a separate company,
but it's not a separate company,
open up its algorithm.
That's the thing. They want
that's just not how science. I mean, algorithmic
This will be our.
You and I can go download and review the source code of Signal if we want to verify Signal's end-to-end encryption. It's the same thing. It doesn't matter who owns it if we can look at under the hood.
Sam, just
1 second. Let me just finish this though. I mean,
we're into
this
it.
is also just not just me, right? Like the ACLU and basically every First Amendment expert in the United States have said this. So like, do you think we're all wrong?
Yes.
Or do you just think that like you really, really want to see this ban, and so you're
no. As a former senior executive at social media companies who knows a lot about the technology of this actually is very important to understand. I actually think all these people on this, I actually don't understand exactly what they're talking about when it comes down to what transparency works and separation. So first, TikTok US is not a separate company from TikTok Core. They want you to believe that. That's the whole point. But even they themselves have said that they will not sell TikTok US separately because, right, the algorithm and because the companies are too tightly intertwined, right? So the reality is like the reason that even TikTok has said we will never sell the asset, right? We will just turn it off is because it cannot be separated. And that fact means that it is not separate. And there's all sorts of documented in the New York Times on breaches between the two. So I think the argument that there's some sort of separate entity is just not true. More importantly, because that's in some ways a sideshow, I'm a big believer in crypto, for instance. And the whole point about crypto is that it is algorithmically open source and provable where the data flows and how it works and how it's secured. You actually can, in something like crypto, in theory, that prove and have a truly open source system. No company in history, like a social media company, is set up for that level of transparency. You cannot guarantee there are not backdoors. You cannot guarantee that there's not leakage, right? And of access in all sorts of ways. So that actually is the fundamental problem. If you told me TikTok was an open source protocol, right, that was distributed, it was actually truly, it was software that was run globally, and like it was totally open source, I'd actually be much closer to agreeing with you. But the fact is it's not. And as a result, there is no way to actually fundamentally prove that it's not manipulated or controlled.
All right. Sure. I'm going to jump in
for
a second. First, this is
try. Just try.
This is fantastic. No. Look, it's best case scenario. No one needs to hear from me on this topic or most topics. The question about Chinese control is fundamental, right, Evan? So my question for you is, do you think that ByteDance, who's the parent company of TikTok, and TikTok as its subsidiary entity, do you think that, when push comes to shove, they can operate independent of the CCP? Like, there's a lot of people say there is no private industry in China because in the end, it all comes, when Xi Jinping wants access and wants something done, he gets it. And there have been, entrepreneurs disappeared in recent times, as I'm sure you know. So let's get into that for a second. I mean, do you think there is a way for them to operate independently of the CCP?
Listen, I am a born and raised anti-authoritarian. You do not have to work that hard to convince me that governments, most governments, but especially the Chinese government, the US government, the Turkish government, the Russian government, and other governments that regularly engage in authoritarian practices are going to do whatever they can to influence public companies to do their bidding. You don't have to like twist my arm to get me to say that.
So,
however, I think this comes down to two very fundamental things. One is, do you believe that your government should be able to tell you where you can get your news, where you can express yourself, and, what letter to the editor you can write to which newspaper? Or do you think that we should have a basic right to express ourselves? Well, the Chinese government made that decision. They ban foreign social media apps. And I think it's frankly outrageous that we would consider combating that type of authoritarianism by imposing our very own Chinese-style firewall right here in the United States.
So
that's one thing. Secondly, let me just make one more point, and then Sam, please dig in.
Yeah.
I think all of these kind of moral, ethical, legal issues aside, let's just talk about efficacy, okay? The Chinese government is very sophisticated, and we have a completely unregulated data broker industry here in the United States. We know that the Russian government and other governments have engaged in sophisticated manipulation campaigns on existing social media platforms, US-based social media platforms, because they all employ that same non-transparent, not open source, algorithmic recommendation model, as Sam just mentioned. And I'll note that we're both big fans of open source, would much rather see some cool open source decentralized protocol as the gold standard for social media across the globe. We don't have that right now. And so what that means is, let's say we did force TikTok to sell itself to a US company, like we did to Grindr. I don't know if any of y'all hang out on Grindr, but some of us have.
One of my friends bought
I missed the window.
But, well, you really missed out, Alex. But let me tell you that this happened with Grindr. Grindr was in part owned by a Chinese company. There was sort of a rapid moral panic concern around what the Chinese government might be able to do with that data. There was a forced divestiture. They sold themselves to a US company. And did that stop the potential privacy abuses? Absolutely not. It was only a matter of months ago that there was reporting showing that a right-wing Christian group was purchasing location data and other data from Grindr, or from a data broker who bought it from Grindr, and using it to track down priests that they thought might be gay. So because we have no basic protections for data here in the US, forcing the sale of TikTok to a US company, do we really think the Chinese government's not sophisticated enough to spin up a US nonprofit or some other institution that can go buy that same data, and that they can't then use that to engage in propaganda and manipulation? That's just ridiculous.
Let's just separate it. First, there's data brokering and who owns what data on the internet and the whole 9 yards. To be totally honest with you, I'm not particularly concerned with China from a data perspective, right? And the initial outcry about TikTok was they're stealing all of Americans' data. I'm not particularly concerned about that, candidly, for probably the same reasons Evan is, which is the reality is that data is all out there anyway, right?
Everyone's doing it.
It's not like there's some huge structural advantage. It's not that big a deal. It's not great, but it's not the thing I'd be focused on personally.
What data is TikTok collecting?
It doesn't even matter. It's sure, if you want to be extreme about it, they have compromat on a bunch of people who are browsing things they probably shouldn't have been, right? They have which they can use to exploit government officials. They have phone numbers, email addresses, and locations for a bunch of Americans. They have pictures of a bunch of things they probably shouldn't have. But the reality is, I'm not that concerned about it because that ship is so sailed, right? It's I'm not sure that you get that much. The big difference, I think, and it's really important, is this, which is I totally agree with Evan that actually a lot of these social media systems, there's all sorts of ways to manipulate who sees what and subvert them and get access to them. We've seen that documented over and over and over again. The question is whether you want the people supposedly guarding and pushing against that, trying to do it, or enabling it, right? And what are their incentives around that? So no American social media company has an incentive to be so. They might not be good at protecting against them all, right? There might be plenty of examples where they screw up, but at least they're aligned with the American people broadly for wanting to keep it from happening. The problem with TikTok is quite the opposite. If they and the Russians share goals of subverting the US, it's they have a pretty clear incentive to be pretty bad, right, at stopping all of this activity. To me, it's fairly obvious that we don't want a country that at a minimum is competitive with us, at maximum go a lot further, right, to have the ability to be the ones that are the supposedly safekeeping Americans from subversion. That just seems ridiculous to me. The First Amendment stuff, look, I agree Americans should have first of all, First Amendment does not protect anyone speaking globally to Americans. It prevents Americans speaking to other Americans. That's what it actually, and it's a very big difference.
There's how many 100 million Americans are on TikTok right now?
Well, the question, interestingly, there's a question, Evan, of sure, there's probably 200 million people watching. There's a very small percent of those are speaking, if we want to get technical about it, but it's a whole other set of issues. The thing with that is they're not prevented at all. That's saying that you can't, that the US Postal Service versus UPS versus 50 other things, they can speak anywhere they want. They can speak in the square. They can post in lots of places. Saying that we have to protect one media company for the sake of quote unquote free speech, we're not preventing anyone from speaking in lots of places, right? They're free to speak. You just can't use an app that's supposed to be where the what is it? What's the line? The foxes are supposed to be guarding the hen house, right? That's the only thing, and it doesn't seem that controversial to me.
So Sam, let me push in one area. What about the slippery slope argument? Okay, because this is a profound and a very new precedent being set, and as I'm sure I might have heard this, Evan, from one of your podcasts on the issue, but 4 of the top 10 most downloaded apps in the past few weeks were Chinese-based companies, including another ByteDance company. You have Temu, CapCut, Shine, and TikTok. You have all our gaming is Chinese. Shein, there you go. Gaming, I mean, kids are addicted to Chinese games, manufacturing software. It's kind of when does it stop? Like this really seems to open the door.
Can I give you a different slippery slope argument that I think is legit? So the best argument for not banning TikTok, right, which as a Facebook shareholder I deeply feel, is if we ban TikTok, which we should, a lot of countries are going to wake up and say, Facebook's the number one app here. And if the US is worried about China controlling our social media space, why are we letting Instagram control ours? Right? They're basically going to turn around and say, it's a very weird precedent to set globally. Like we draw a lot of global power from the fact that, again, I trust us in a way I don't trust the Chinese, but ultimately, like, almost the entire world is speaking to its local populations through apps that we control. And so I actually think it sets a very bad precedent. I think it is actually extremely bad for Facebook, for Meta, for us to ban TikTok for exactly that reason, which is going to open up a lot of global questions. Unfortunately, I still think we have to do it for national security purposes.
Well, and so, okay, a couple things here. And, one, I just want to push back a little bit on the overall frame of this conversation. And maybe this is just, where we politically diverge, but I'm just going to come in and say, I care less about American interests, quote unquote, than I care about global human rights, democracy, and the basic value of free expression. So, call me not a patriot or whatever. I will take it as a compliment. But I do think it's important that we ask ourselves, what does it look like when a government that purports to be defending those types of values engages in an act of censorship as extreme as banning an app that's used by hundreds of millions of people to express themselves? There's a tiny handful of countries in the world that do that right now. It's China, it's Russia, it's Turkey, it's Saudi Arabia. You really want to add us to that list? How does that lead to the type of world we want our kids to grow up in?
So again, a few things.
One more thing really quick. And so if we go down this road of saying, well, the First Amendment's cool and all, free expression's cool and all, social media is cool and all, but national security, okay, we could be months away from another Trump administration. And I don't know how people here feel about the former president, but I have a lot of concerns about authoritarian policies that he might engage in. You really think it's out of the question that a future president couldn't do the same thing and wave their hands and sort of vaguely say national security to ban another social media app, even one perhaps based in the US, by claiming a lot of the same things that you're saying about TikTok? Right? Well, Trump's going around saying we shouldn't ban TikTok because Mark Zuckerberg's the real enemy, right?
To be clear, this is my.
You really want to set that precedent right now? That doesn't make me sleep well at night.
A few things. One, yes, I'm sure we're politically different. I actually think that the United States is good and exports good values overall. We have our problems like everyone else, but I do believe that the world is far better off with a strong America than a weak America. So that is maybe a place we politically diverge. I do think free expression is critical. Maybe something we do agree on is I'm a huge believer in open source. I'm a huge crypto believer. Candidly, I'm a huge believer in encryption, right? And I actually think when you add all those things together, if you and I came up with our ideal world of the internet, it would probably be actually pretty similar. Although I will say that the difference is I think that's a great world and where we have to be. I think it's also a terrifying world, and it'll be extremely challenging world. This whole idea that 200 million Americans use themselves to express themselves on TikTok, I think that's pretty overblown. The reality is a very small percentage of people actually use TikTok to post. They're mostly consuming, right? It's like a 1% thing where it's 99% production, 1% consumption. So let's instead of saying 200 million Americans are using Express, let's say that maybe 2 million million Americans are using themselves and 200 million are consuming. So I think we should talk about order of magnitude effects here in terms of where we're at. And if said, Sam, would you ask those 2 million users to use any of the other apps that are American where we're not worried about the people who are effectively supposed to be guarding the safety of it from attacks, from intervention, also being the people who want to see subversion happen? I just think that's a trade that we pragmatically have to make. And look, I'm not psyched about it. But again, when you get into the politics about all this stuff, it's it is worth noting, regardless of what your politics are, you might say, hey, it's true that, let's put it this way. It is interesting that you're arguing the same argument that Donald Trump is arguing at this point, right? Which is Donald Trump also wants to see TikTok stay in the country, right? Which is just my only
he
point
really
that,
also cares about global human rights and democracy and the value of free expression.
My only point
you and he have that in
he
common.
loves trans kids too.
My only, I mean, again, it's just interesting. It's, you know, it is interesting. Like, I think, you know, again, I don't know you really or your politics, but based on the little you've said on this call, it's like, I would only say that you got to keep the politics out of this, largely because it is a weird thing where, like, Donald Trump and the Chinese government are promoting a thing that I think the people who use it, like, couldn't disagree more with. So it's like, it's a total mess when you get politically. I think you have to start from, like, national security and actual first principles here versus
I mean,
talking about
I'll
politics.
just say that, like, you know, for myself as a civil liberties advocate, it is not unusual, right, for us to be in these sort of funky environments. And you're probably familiar with this with encryption, right? There are groups on the left that claim end-to-end encryption is terrible because it allows people to spread all this disinformation and hateful content, and we can't see it, so we can't censor it. We got folks on the right that say end-to-end encryption is terrible because it lets all these terrorists and Antifa activists and whatever. Look, but I have a value that I stick by. And with TikTok,
I'm with you.
Comes to that, right? A consistent ideology of defending free expression and opposing government-imposed internet censorship. And you can't just say, but national security. In the same way that I bet, Sam, you would agree, you know, the NSA's mass surveillance programs could maybe prevent a terrorist attack. Well, we probably both agree that it's not worth the trade-off of abandoning our value of protecting people's basic right to privacy.
I actually would say
that theoretical future terrorist.
I would say it differently. I think the thing that you and I probably both agree on is a world of true end-to-end encryption and a distributed open source platform as the way the world communicates is what we probably both ideally would want. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, let's build it. I'm down. Let's raise some money. Let's go do it.
Well, we have a venture capitalist with us. Yeah, we have a seed funder. So
never been tried before, right? Like, because I do think the thing you probably also both agree on the disagreement, right, is that, you know, in the end of the day, any organization that has its goals, the U.S. wants to defend itself. The Chinese want to, you know, control more of, you know, the world's wealth and be an insurgent military and blah, 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 blah. Everyone has their incentives and they're going to respond. So we can cry that, like, the NSA did a bunch of stuff we don't like and is probably illegal in a lot of cases or questionably. But in the end of the day, the fact that we don't like it, it's like, if it's possible, it's going to happen, right? And so the reality is we'd much rather have mathematically secure and complete systems. We just don't have them, right? And so I think that's where it puts us into a mess, which is we might agree on the extreme theoretics, but then you get down to the brass tacks of, like, okay, like, what do you want to actually happen? And to me, again, I go back to this thing, which is like, it just makes no sense to me that in the complexities of reality, you would ever want a foreign adversary controlling not the speech, to be clear, but the routing of the speech any way they please without oversight.
I mean, you know, we have a lot of case law to suggest that the routing of the speech and the speech itself, there's no meaningful distinction from a First Amendment perspective. So,
the First Amendment, I just think we're relying on. Look, first of all, I think the First Amendment is super complicated and nuanced, as we both know, and it's not so black and white. And I agree, this is gray. I don't think this is like, but I personally think it's very defensible to say, look, this is not actually a First Amendment issue. People want it to be, who want a certain outcome. But it's not.
Okay. All right. So it seems like, to boil this down, China, let's say China has a super weapon, which, you know, I think the case that China at least has a fair amount of control over ByteDance, and ByteDance has access to the phones and the hearts and minds of, you know, 40% of the US population. There is certainly something that could be used to subvert American interest at some point in time. Evan, it seems like you're at least open to that possibility. I think you both agree that it likely hasn't been used yet.
There's no reason to there's no reason to believe that it has been, and there is reason to believe that even if it had been, anyone who's sophisticated would make it impossible to detect.
Right. So Evan, your position is that in the absence of evidence, we should do nothing, and that's like not that we should do nothing. We should do. We should do
I think it's about
algorithmic legislation and data privacy legislation.
Well, it's more than that, because it's really about where are we trying to get? Do we want to stay in this environment that we're in, where we have essentially 5 companies that control a monopoly on human attention, right? Most of those companies are based in the US. We're very concerned about this one company that's outside the US. But the only reason we care about TikTok is because they're one of 5 companies that basically have enormous control over the discourse. And I think Sam and I would both agree that that is a very dangerous situation, period. Even let's say we do ban TikTok, it's still dangerous. Now we have 4 companies that more or less control discourse, online speech, human attention. I think we'd all like to have a future where we have more choices. And so from my perspective, if Congress wants to do something to get us out of this dangerous situation where another government could potentially engage in some super weapon, massive covert propaganda operation, then what we need to do is get past this incredibly centralized big tech monopoly surveillance capitalism moment that we're in and get to a future where we have meaningful choices and meaningful transparency. And that means not banning one app, but passing legislation that puts us on that path. And I think privacy and antitrust legislation would actually get us there versus banning TikTok, which actually consolidates the social media market even more, making it more of a choke point for governments, whether it's our government or a foreign government.
So Evan, just to push you though, I think that you could, there's a valid conversation to have about a lot of what you're saying. I just don't see why it can't be both. Like, I have absolutely no problem with that longer term conversation, but we all know that that's like a decade plus long. Like, that's not a tomorrow thing to think about agriculture. It's just like there's no functional reality or practical reality in which we
came within a threat of passing antitrust bills last Congress, and part of the reason they failed is because the GOP went off the deep end on this xenophobic "let's wring our hands about TikTok" instead of actually cracking down on big tech monopoly power.
From a pragmatic perspective, right? Anything you want to talk about in terms of algorithmic transparency or how you feel about consolidated social media, or whatever, is going to be many, 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 many years, right, in the making. And on the flip side, the TikTok thing, which is a special case in America, it's not a special case foreign in other places because you can make all sorts of money, but in the United States, it's a special case where there's a clear national security issue. It seems like you should just do that because it's practical and clearly a problem. And then you can deal with the other stuff as it comes, and you should. I'm not saying not to have those conversations, but I think saying that we should allow an adversary to control so much speech space in this very amorphous way with very unclear controls where their interests are clearly not aligned with ours, just because there's also a different conversation to have, seems like you're kind of cutting off your nose to spite your face. Like, it just seems like you do the easy thing that's in front of you that we can all agree has some very problematic problems, and then you have a longer conversation.
I think what I'm arguing is I think banning TikTok actually takes us a step backwards.
But
it makes
why?
the social media market even more consolidated. We have then more of a choke point.
Look,
it brings us further. And I think just leaning into this like tech nationalist politics versus something that's more rooted in the historical values of democratic values and free expression takes us away from the type of social media environment we need.
Let me just push you.
Because we have these big tech companies in the US who, by the way, have been funding a lot of this animosity toward TikTok, right? Like that's been reported on, and it's very much in their interest.
It's not. So a few things. One, it's not in their interest. In fact, I go so far as to say, I think if you actually are excited about pushing this question about algorithmic transparency and social media consolidation, it's actually in your interest for TikTok to get banned, because then apps like Instagram can't say, well, we're only a fifth of the market. They're like, actually, you are the market. So if you actually want to see that long term, you should be advocating for TikTok to be taken out, because then your argument is stronger, right?
That's an interesting argument. Are you saying because power would be entrenched and more consolidated in Meta, then the antitrust momentum would be improved by that?
Well, look, this is the thing I think, again, if you're being strategic about this as opposed to anything else, you'd say, look, TikTok's great for Meta. TikTok's great for the other players because they get to point and say, look, we have a legitimate, serious competitor up and coming, right? Like, we're not a monopoly. You're saying it's a 5-person monopoly. I don't want to be pedantic, but like 5 companies is not a monopoly, right? 5 companies is a pretty competitive landscape, right? And so the
If
reality
we had
is
only
that,
5 newspapers in the world, how would you feel about
well,
that?
we effectively only do, to be clear, like that matter, right? Like, so the reality is like,
And it sucks, right? Like,
but again,
that's why we all like social
well, look,
media.
there's only 2 ways out, right? Forward. One is, which has been tried many times, is proven to be extremely difficult. There's a lot of people, and actually you and I agreed on this potentially for different reasons, but we're agreed on it. Like, someone does a really good job of building a decentralized open platform that is auditable fully because it's an open source thing and is encrypted. That'd be great. I'd love that world. But someone actually, like, you need a tech entrepreneur or someone to like crush it building that, right? And there are, we just don't have that. That would be one great
Follow me
platform.
on Blue Sky, everyone. I'm there. Peace.
It's just not, but that's actually kind of the joke. Like, Blue Sky's become a disaster recently, right? Like, so like the reality is, like, if your Blue Sky's your thing, it's like, you got some issue. It's a problem, right? So you got that path, or you have some sort of regulatory path, which again, I think ironically, like, again, I'm not advocating this, I have a different set of beliefs, but like, if you really want to see these big apps get slapped both nationally and internationally, you should be advocating for the ban of TikTok, because all of a sudden, if we ban TikTok, every country in the world wakes up and says, well, wait a minute, shouldn't we ban Facebook then? Because it's the same problem with just different players, right? Which will get towards your goal. And you'll end up with a more consolidated media landscape in the US, which will actually advance what you want. So like, I don't actually
the global
want the same
internet,
things, but like,
the global internet is then completely over. There's no shred of it. If everyone starts banning Facebook in every other country,
totally.
There's a dystopian. I mean, whatever optimism one had during the Arab Spring or whatever. I mean, it is the most dystopian version. Well, if everyone's banning Facebook everywhere, and
to be clear, I look at this and I trust American companies. They are separated from the government. I trust the operators of those companies. Their things are challenging. I think that Facebook, in the early days, the story was exporting democracy, exporting free speech. I actually believe it does that. I believe that that WhatsApp does that. I want those things, right? But I agree. I mean, you're going to end up. The reality is like, I think in some ways you can't. It's just an interesting situation where, like, I actually think, again, your immediate goals, everyone will be better served by TikTok collapsing, right, than not.
I mean, I'd love to see all of them collapse so that we can, build.
Well, that's you got.
Unicorn
This is
social
your
media, decentralized thing on top of their ashes. But I don't see that.
I think
like,
that's.
If that were true, then why would Meta be funding, like right-wing lobbying groups to attack TikTok?
It's
like that.
It's so much more complicated than
they're
that.
Not stupid.
No, you know what? They're not stupid, but I would argue that I would also say that they fully recognize that TikTok is very good for them. TikTok's not bad for Meta. TikTok's actually really great for them.
So is the lobbying? Are you saying that they're not lobbying to ban TikTok,
or
that it's nuance? There's also
like the Chamber of Progress, which is predominantly funded by big tech companies, has been calling to ban TikTok. They funded Targeted Victory or whatever the lobbying group.
It's so much more complicated than that, right? But all I'm saying is that, again, these foils, like, it is critical if you really just don't lose the fact that, like, TikTok is good, not bad, for big American tech. It's not bad, right?
Let's move on to the next phase of TikTok, because this obviously, the next 270 days, everything, there's a lot that is up in the air, and this is a very relevant conversation. So basically, the law that was passed gives ByteDance 270 days, maybe up to a year, to divest TikTok and find an American buyer. Now, to me, this seems kind of crazy on a lot of levels. Like, first, obviously, China has said explicitly, and I tend to believe them on this one, that they will not allow the algorithm to go with the company. In which case, TikTok without the algorithm is just sort of a fairly
who knows?
Underwhelming. No,
who knows?
Okay.
Is the on it? Like,
but it's not just that.
I agree that everyone likes to say that. I agree with you that it's very unlikely that TikTok in the US actually gets divested. It will probably just get shut down. But everyone likes to say, oh, the algorithm. I agree that the algorithm is very good. My bet is that a skunkwork team with 20 people could get you 95% of the algorithm in a few months if you really wanted to.
But then it's so let me just try to understand this. So, but even let's say you get to 95% of the algorithm, then you have this sort of severed like limb of a global platform that is US only. I mean, because TikTok will still exist in every other country or most other countries.
To be clear, it doesn't. It doesn't exist in India because India was smart and banned it. Right? The Chinese version of TikTok is incredibly different than the American version.
But,
so this
but
idea
it would
that
be
like
a US.
We also know that the TikTok ban in India basically didn't work because people just use a VPN to access it, which is what they do in China to get around their great firewall, and what teens are doing in
China doesn't have access to
campuses where they,
Right.
So I mean, again, so just talking about like efficacy, like if we actually think it's going to work, I don't think it's going to.
It doesn't need to, but no, it doesn't need.
But again,
to work.
I just want to point out, you did just say that you think the most likely scenario is that it actually will be banned, which is exactly what every First Amendment expert has been saying, which is why we argue that this clearly and blatantly violates the Constitution, which is why I don't think we'll actually be having this conversation come election time, because I think they're going to win in court. Because
I think
what the bill sponsors claimed was that we can pass First Amendment muster because they can sell it in time.
No.
And I think, Sam, you're probably more savvy about business than I am, but I think we'd both agree that like, it's not that easy to say. Forget all the algorithm stuff and whether they'll sell it with the algorithm.
Look,
it takes a lot of time to sell a company that
There
size.
are plenty of you could sell it like technically in time. I do think I agree with you that I think for a whole bunch of reasons, which is largely like the Chinese have no interest in operating TikTok and like of selling it this way. Like it probably won't happen. That I agree with you, which is I don't know if you've seen the Nancy Pelosi video of her saying how we're improving TikTok, but it's one of the funnier things I've ever seen. Like. In terms of the market. So like there's a bunch of crazy stuff on it. But I think like, yeah, I mean, I think the First Amendment thing is interesting. I personally don't think it's such a cut and dry issue as some people claim it is. I think moreover, it's again, at the end of the day, it's like, it almost doesn't even matter from my perspective. It's like, it's very simple. It's like, does America defend itself or not? And if it's not going to, which honestly would be the current course and speed in a lot of places, I'm sad. And I think it's extremely dangerous because I do think what will happen is like, we'll look back and the Chinese will take Taiwan, right? And like, by the way, the American youth will celebrate it because they were told to celebrate it. And like, that's wild.
I just want to push back on that a little bit because I think it's not giving young people in this country enough credit. I mean, like, it's just,
let's not get into that one. On that one,
I just think we're getting a little bit too into like violent video games, like poison the mind of our youth. I mean, how is this not the same like moral panic that everyone spread around social media in general? Like, even the stuff with Palestine, like people like, the GOP keeps pointing to this and saying it's TikTok making the kids like Palestine. And it's like, no, the demographic like breakdown is the same. Young people are more pro-Palestine. And so TikTok is more pro-Palestine. It's not a conspiracy.
The algorithm, but it's also simple because the algorithm reinforces whatever initial, political inclinations one has. So it's like, once you're on TikTok, if you express anything, sympathetic to Palestinians, there is a massively self-reinforcing algorithm that's just driving deeper and deeper division and polarization. Like,
which is the exact same thing on Instagram and
correct.
YouTube.
Everywhere.
Right? I mean,
and that's why I'm trying to do this show. I mean, that's the whole point of bringing the you two together, because
the difference is there's a very fundamental difference, right? Which is the Instagram has no fundamental interest in fucking up America. Zero, right? Like, you can argue whether they're good or bad and like the challenges but I promise you, it's just like the board, the executives, there's no interest in screwing up America. China has every interest in the world in sowing division in our democracy as a non-democracy. They want to point us and say, look, that democracy thing doesn't work at all. And so regardless of the state of playing field, you have one team that is interested, whether or not they're competent, they're interested and aligned, and one team that is literally their entire incentive set is for us to get fucked up. And like, I just wonder which one you want running social media. So,
I mean, I guess, again, this does come down to worldview at a certain point, right? If your worldview is that the U.S. government is good and great and always does great things, and other governments are bad, then that's true. But the U.S. government has tremendous interest in disrupting other countries' democratic processes. I mean, look at all of Latin America for the last 30 plus years. Look at Egypt, look at Yemen. Right? Like, our government is actively engaging in propaganda operations in other countries that undermine democratic processes, that uphold dictatorships, that are brutal, that are murdering their own people.
It's not
we're doing the same thing. So, like, do we want to become more like the Chinese, or do we want to fight for values of global human rights?
Excuse me, can
right?
I just jump in? There's I think these are not parallel situations. In the U.S., I don't know. I mean, one thing I've seen a lot in my career, I very much believe, is that there's a big separation between the government and business, right? Say whatever you want about the U.S. government, right? The reality is the Americans who run the American internet properties have no interest in anything but profit maximization, period, right? And you can argue, you might like that analogy, but it's simple. And the reality is like they have no interest in like screwing up the US, right? Because it's against their profit instinct and their profit interest. Now,
we're going to agree to disagree. I have one quick question, and then we're going to do just a little final little segment. All right.
It's just funny that basically Apple has done such a masterful job of redirecting this whole conversation to be about the social media companies, when the real conversation that I think Evan and I think we probably should actually be having is at that level. Because if you want to know, for instance, why there's no open source, encrypted end-to-end messaging platform we're all chatting on, don't blame Meta, blame Apple, right? And like that's the funny thing is they've done a great job at redirecting it into this like micro thing about like TikTok when actually they hold all the cards.
No, I think that is somewhere we would agree. Apple's monopoly power and abuse is under.
So fuck study. Apple.
Can I just say one last
fuck Apple? Yes.
Fuck Apple. There we go. All right, we all agreed on that. Really quick, I just want to say we've been talking about this in a very theoretical way, right? We've been talking about the legal aspects. We've been talking about the national security aspects. I do just want to bring it back down for a second to just like actual people, and I want to remind folks that there are like. And we can debate whether it's 1 million or 2 million or 200 million or whatever, but there are a large number of people, especially young people, and we know it's also disproportionately popular with LGBTQ youth and youth of color, who have built communities and audiences on this platform, some of whom have built careers on this platform. They're using it right now to organize protests across the country. You may agree with those protests or disagree with those protests, but it is absolutely a tool that is being used by young people to shape their world. And so, we can agree or disagree on right or wrong banning it, but I do think we need to consider the actual material impact. Well, of what is it like? If you have 100 million followers on TikTok that you've spent the last 2 years building up, and then suddenly that's ripped out from underneath you, that has a profound effect on our democratic process.
Well,
and I think we really need to consider that in a serious way and not just think about it in theory.
Okay, but Evan, in making it practical and like talking about real numbers here, right, in terms of how people actually are, two things I call out on that. One is, again, people like to cite this 200 million number. It's not 200 million. It's probably about 2 million, right? So like we're not talking.
Sure, let's say it's 2 million though. Fine. That's still a lot of people.
Would you sacrifice?
This is an important tool, and we're about to take it away from
Let me keep going. The other thing that's really unique about TikTok, and this is their whole insight, is these are not. It's not like we're used to we're older. Like we use Twitter. Probably Facebook or Instagram to some degree. These are not built audiences, right? These are not people who scraped together, posted, built a community, whatever. TikTok's whole design, right, is they show you whatever they want and promote videos however they want, right, and blow things up and collapse things with an incredible amount of central control. To that end, I think it's actually wrong to think about these audiences as things that have been built and are semi-owned in a certain sense. Instead, they're just given and blown up and collapsed at will. Right. And I think that is a very, very different thing because there's no asset there that you're trusting other than TikTok's algorithm and willingness to promote you, which can change second to second. Right.
I mean, that's true on all of these platforms. And why I think both of us would like something more decentralized. But it's the reality, I just don't, that is not my experience of how young people use the platform.
I watch I watch a lot of sandwich videos on Instagram and now TikTok for the past week. I mean, the quality of how you make a sandwich matters when you're building your audience. It's not a random just distribution that the Chinese government feels like, building up some random, the quality of the sandwich matters.
To a point, but I just keep in mind the fact that again, the reason TikTok even worked in the first place is actually that people of our generation, right, had built up bigger followings on more traditional apps that were real followings that people actively chose to follow them. And what happened was a bunch of young people felt like they couldn't actually get an angle on anything. They couldn't get any distribution because they were actually they were younger. They weren't there when it started. So they're starting at a disadvantage. So one of the key insights TikTok had was effectively randomly dumping a huge amount of attention on people, right? Which then allowed them, it was almost like an inflation function to like build, to get stuff out there and then feel really good because they had actually people watch their stuff as opposed to going to the void. My basic point only being that, like, one, again, as I said first, let's not like overstate it. We're not talking about like 200 million creators. We're talking about maybe a few million, maybe. And then two, we're not talking about like long-term built audiences. We're talking about an algorithm that distributes views.
But they are relying on that algorithm for their, like, to feed their families and pay rent right now.
There's a tiny look. I invest in a lot of creators, right? And I actually know quite a bit about the financial side of it. The number of people that are full-time TikTok creators is not zero, but it is infinitesimally small. It's actually.
I'll just say, look, the business arguments are important, but that's not, for me as a human rights advocate, that's not my primary concern. Is like, people are going to lose their income. My primary concern is that people use this app to express themselves, and they've built online communities there. And people who have historically been silenced are using this app to suppress themselves. And it's not a coincidence that it's the first app to face meaningful regulation in the US.
And again, it's not because of who's using it. It's just because it's a non-transparent system with state actors that are aggressive.
That might be why you want to ban it, Sam. But let's be honest, that for a lot of Republican members of Congress, it's just China bad, and we don't like Palestine, right? So let's be honest, and we don't like gays, right? Like that. Go listen to the rhetoric from the congressional hearings. They're being so explicit about it.
And let me read this quote. Sam, because I don't think this this doesn't really undermine your argument, but from Mitt Romney, he said, I think this was a few days ago, some wonder why there was such overwhelming support for us to shut down TikTok or other entities of that nature. If you look at the postings on TikTok and the number of mentions of Palestinians relative to other social media sites, it's overwhelmingly so amongst TikTok broadcasts. Then a Democrat from Illinois, Raja Krishnamurthy, apologies for that. He was part of the Thunder Run sort of small group of people that pushed this through secretly, or gained secret momentum and then unveiled it. He said the Israel-Gaza conflict stoked lawmakers' appetites to regulate the app. So to say that there's no influence.
If I were TikTok's lawyer, I would walk into court with that in my hand, because that is the exact evidence they need to show that this is about speech.
No, it's not about it. Look,
it's related politically.
No, I think what it is it's kind of like when the Arab Spring happened, right? And if you remember back to that, I think you guys are contemporaries of mine, so you remember that. There was a moment where the entire world was like, oh my God, Facebook is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Look at what's been achieved, right, with the Arab Spring and the flowering of speech and democracy. Turns out that was a disaster, right? When you look back a few years later, how it played out there, disaster, right? Like you talk about where the actual tack-ons are there. So I think these things can be wake-up calls while still not being the main point. To me, I don't actually have any idea what's going on with the Gaza stuff, but I do know, and I think it's very irrefutable, I think Taiwan is the perfect example, that they have a super weapon, and it's disgraceful for us not to fix it.
All right, final segments. These will be quick. Here we go. What would have to change? What would have to be different at some point in the either near future or future for you to change your mind on this issue? Okay, so
what's the issue?
Material conditions on banning TikTok. So in the next 6 months, in the next 270 days, what would have to be different for you to change your mind and reverse your current position? So I'll start with Evan.
I would be fine with banning TikTok if we also ban Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Amazon, Microsoft. Let me think of a couple others.
All right, we're good. We're good.
Let's ban them all and start over. Then I'm okay with it.
Sam, what would make you reverse? What could, in theory, make you reverse your position?
Well, again, to be clear, from my position again, for quote unquote banning TikTok, look, that's a good question. I think if there was some construct where they legitimately could sell it and really sever ties completely to ByteDance, I think it's fine. Like, I don't think that's feasible, but like, I think the arguments about the algorithm are a little bit overblown, because I think that the reality is, at this point, TikTok has a good algorithm, but it's not that hard to get something close enough to keep it going. I just don't think that's realistically going to happen. But again, I don't think, that's kind of the way I would think.
But there's no scenario. You don't see any change in material conditions that would have you support not divesting it.
I mean, it'd be interesting. I wonder if there's some scenario of the Chinese, representative, if the Chinese representative of the government stepped off the board, right? If they elected a new set of directors, like there's probably some scenario of oversight and retranching who actually is in charge of the thing that you kind of let it keep playing. But it's not going to.
Okay. Last question. This is our Steel Manning segment. Are you familiar with the term steel manning?
No.
Either of you, both of you. Okay.
No.
So it's the opposite of a straw man. It's the opposite of a straw man. So where you take your disagreement partner's position and you articulate it in the best faith, strongest way possible, just to show that you understand it. So this is not your actual, like, where your conviction lies. It's just to show that you understand in good faith your disagreement partner's position. So who wants to go first? Remember, you got to sell it. All right, you got to sell it.
All right, I'm going to sell it. So I think, I think Sam's right to not focus on the data privacy issues, because I think, that's where it is just crystal clear that that A, every other company has the same problem, that B, we could solve those issues with the privacy law, and that C, if the Chinese government or any other government wants access to Americans' data, they have so many avenues to do that banning TikTok would not accomplish that. And so I think focusing in on the fact that the Chinese government could manipulate what TikTok shows to who, and that could have an influence on national discourse in the US, is right. And I think that, and you can argue that there are national security exceptions to the First Amendment. And so if the government can prove in good faith that the only way that they can address those national security concerns is through a forced divestiture or a ban, then it could pass First Amendment scrutiny. Obviously, I disagree with all of that, but I think it is not a, you don't have to be a crazy person to make that argument. Sam, I think you're probably very smart. We just strongly disagree.
Fair enough, Evan.
All right, that was pretty good. I give that a B plus ish.
All right, yeah, it wasn't my best.
You had it, and at the end, you had to like immediately.
I just got to make sure no one clips it and posts it.
No,
and
we'll
I
be
get
good
trouble,
with that.
Exactly.
It's understand. We'll help protect you. All right, Sam, like really get into character here. You don't have to reference anyone else. It's just.
I'm worried about getting clipped. I wasn't thinking about that before.
We'll protect it.
I think the argument for not banning TikTok is that the internet's current state is pretty messed up broadly in a whole set of forms. In an ideal world, we would have a fully decentralized, fully encrypted speech platform that allows humans digitally to operate much as they do in the physical space before technology, where we can have conversations in the back of bars and they just exist temporally and we build relationships that way. And there's no central proxy at all anywhere, right? And so the argument for not banning TikTok is, look, some people use it as their medium of communication, just as some people use email and some people use text messaging and some people use Facebook and some people use Instagram, and you can go on and on and on and on and on. And singling it out, right, versus all the other problems that we have is just like a sideshow to the main issues that, Evan cares more about, right, which is the broader set of problems. So it becomes a sideshow that distracts from the broader set of issues. Now, to do the Evan final thing, like, I disagree with that, because I think the reality is it's one of those things where, like, not necessarily wrong that there are a bunch of broader problems, but not addressing an immediate national security concern to hold your breath for those problems, I think is a tactically very bad decision. But I don't disagree that there's a bunch of broader issues.
Okay. Well, Evan and Sam, this was a highly spirited disagreement and a fun one. And I appreciate both of you. So
cheers.
Thanks so much. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
I enjoy the disagreement.